Hey guys, welcome back here. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at EIGRP address families. So EIGRP, when we deal with named mode, has now broken everything down into what we call address families, or AF, right? And in our address families, we have two different options. We have IPv4 and we have IPv6. We have some other options, and I want to kind of clear that up, and that's between unicast and multicast. And I'm going to do this in a minute, so don't get crazy. So multicast and unicast. The default here is going to be unicast. A lot of people get confused here because, we see multicast and we think, well, we're forming a multicast relationship. We're forming a multicast, adjacency with this router because we're going to send out our multicast hellos to 224.0.0.10. That's still going to take place when we have our unicast relationship. The multicast option under the address family is going to be when we deal with things like PIM, protocol independent multicast, and we're dealing with maybe we're trying to get past an RPF failure, and maybe we need to form a multicast adjacency going this way or something along those lines to have PIM actually work. That's what this is for, okay? A lot of people go in that are new to named mode, and they go in and they say, hey, you know what? I'm going to use multicast instead of unicast because, you guys are on the right track. You think, okay, I'm going to form a multicast relationship. But that's not how named mode works, okay? You're going to form a unicast relationship by default, and that's still going to send out these multicast hellos, all right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use named mode here on R2. We're going to use named mode here on R1, and what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll run classic over here on R3. Our autonomous system that we're going to use is going to be 1, 2, 3. Now the names that we're going to run are going to be different, so I'm not going to note those in here. What we're actually going to do is use the router number for the name. So we'll have the named mode, R1, named mode R2, and what we're going to see is that the name actually doesn't matter, but the autonomous system is what's going to matter. So you can see that I just booted up my gear. You can see that all these three routers just actually came up. So let's wake them up here and let's actually start configuring and let's start getting everything set up. By the way, we are going to do both IPv4 and IPv6 to make sure that you guys understand, essentially the differences and how we do certain things. So we'll say router EIGRP, and here is normally where I would come in and I would type in just my autonomous system, but I'm not going to do that this time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enter in this virtual number or this virtual name router, which in this case is going to be R1. Now, here I have multiple different options, but what I'm going to do is say address family, and here's where I have IPv4 6. So I'm going to say IPv4, and here are where, again, most people get confused. First of all, if you're going to set up a VRF, so if you're running any type of different VRF, if you're doing layer 3 VPN, if you're doing MPLS configurations, or you just have VRFs set up, this is where you're going to configure your EIGRP named mode to use a VRF and obviously receive or send routes into that particular network or interface. Again, your unicast and multicast. Now again, this here is going to be the default. Okay, the default is going to cause EIGRP to run the same way it always has. If you use unicast, you don't need to go in and use the neighbor statement. Again, one thing that really confuses folks, because you see unicast and as network engineers, you think it's one-to-one. You think, okay, I'm just going to form a peering between R1 and R3 or whatever. It's not the case. The default is going to be unicast. The only time you're going to use multicast is, again, when you need to get PIM working in a multicast relationship. So again, if we had something like an RPF failure and we needed to get R1 to form a multicast adjacency between R1 through R3 and say, hey, it's okay to receive multicast packets from R1, through R3, that's when we would use multicast, okay? But otherwise, you guys are going to use unicast. If I don't type anything here, the default is going to go ahead and say unicast. What I need to do, though, is I need to say autonomous system, and what I'm going to do is just simply enter 1, 2, 3. You can see that drops me down into what we call the address family. Now, here is where I'm going to find things like my neighbor statements if I wanted to do it. Here's where I would find my network statement, remote neighbors. Here's where I would find different EIGRP commands if I wanted to do that. So if I go in here and I say EIGRP, I would find my default route tags, my router ID. Here's where I would find if I want to make this a stub. So in classic, I would say EIGRP stub. I'm going to type that underneath my IPv4 address family. Now, what I do need to do is I need to go ahead and use the network command because I need to go ahead and enable my EIGRP process on this interface here. So I'm going to go ahead and say 10.1.2.1, and I'm going to say 000, or essentially a /32. Now, the thing here is that a lot of people sometimes question, regardless whether you're using classic or named mode, what should you really do here? I always recommend that you do a /32 network statement on your interfaces, unless if you have a router or a switch and you have multiple, let's say SVIs, switch virtual interfaces, that you're going to enable EIGRP on. You have 10 of them or 20 of them and they're all /30s, then I would probably just go in and say 255 here, because I don't want 10 or 20 or whatever /32 network statements. I would probably just say, look, they're all /30s, just enable it everywhere, on that /24 and call it a day. But here in this case, I always recommend using a /32 network statement, okay? Do show run section router, EIGRP, get with it, JP, EIGRP. Okay, here's what our configuration looks like now at this moment, right? So now I have my address family. Here's where I have my autonomous system. Here's my network command that's going to go ahead and enable the multicast hellos to start going out of that interface. And in fact, let's say debug EIGRP, and we're going to say packets, and we'll go ahead and say hellos. So let's see if we have any hello packets that are actually going out of that interface. We should. And here you see sending hello, right? So let's say debug IP packet. Actually, let's say undebug all, and we'll say debug IP packet. And we should see that we have it going to 224.0.0.10. Let's just wait for a minute here and wait for it to come up. Let's say unall, and there you have it. So we do still see these multicast hello packets going out to 224.0.0.10, even though if you look at our configuration up here, again, the default option was unicast. We don't have any neighbor statement, just the nature of the beast. So don't let this confuse you when you're dealing with the EIGRP named mode, okay? A few more things here. Do show run section router EIGRP. Let's actually go back into our process here. Let's take a look at this topology base for a minute. If I go into the topology base, I'm going to find all these commands like auto summarization, my default originate, default metric, my distance if I want to tweak my administrative distance, if I want to set up a distribute list, offset list, redistribution. I'm going to find all these different commands underneath my topology base. What I am going to do here is say redistribute connected, because do show IP interface brief E assigned. I want all of these interfaces essentially to crank into my EIGRP process, okay? Now, one more thing that I want to show you, and that's my address family. Oh, I need to exit out of here. My address family interface. Now, here is where I would apply all of the interface specific commands that I would normally use. So for example, maybe I would go in here on, in the old days in Classic, I would go in on this interface and say, hey, I want to send a summary address, or, I want authentication. In the Classic days, I would have to do that underneath that individual or that specific interface in order to do that, right? Well, in EIGRP named mode, I don't do it under the individual interface or the physical interface config anymore. I do it under the address family interface, okay? So what I'll do here is I'll show you two different options. You have to be careful with the default. I believe the summary address, and there may be one other two commands that are not available under the default. So if I have, let's say, 20 interfaces on a router or a switch, and I want to send out a summary address out all of them, there's no way I can do that under the address family default. There's no summary address command, but split horizon, passive interface, the hold time, again, these would be all things that I would have to enter underneath the physical interface. So I would have to go in under the interface and say BFD or whatever. I would not be able to do this under the address family interface, right? Or I should say the EIGRP process. However, here, that's where I can go ahead and do this. I'm going to say exit. I'm going to say address family interface, and I'm going to say E00, and you can see that I have now the summary address command, which is what I'm going to use. And I'm just going to say /0. Now I'm just doing this to show you guys how to do it. do show run section router EIGRP. So here's our IPv4 configuration. So we have our IPv4 unicast address family. The name is not going to matter. So when we go ahead and we pass our EIGRP packets from R1 to R2, we're not going to care about the name. R1 is going to form an adjacency with 123. R2 should get a default route. We're only going to send that default route out Ethernet 00. We can't do it with the default. And everybody else, we're going to say redistribute connected. We're going to go ahead and activate the EIGRP process on that network. So let's go ahead and let's get R2 configured and going. Wake up. Config T, router EIGRP, we're going to call him R2. Address family IPv4 unicast. You don't have to type unicast if you don't want to. Okay, and what I'm going to do is say network 10.1.2.2, all zeros. We're going to say topology base, say redistribute connected, control C, show run section router EIGRP. There's our configuration. So very, very simple, very easy. Really what most people struggle with is they haven't used it before, they haven't done it before, and they're confused, right? It just it's like anything. If you're not used to it, you kind of fumble. If you're used to it, you blow through it and you're done. So we have an adjacency that came up. You can see that here. Let's say show IP route EIGRP. We have the default route that came in, so you see the gateway of last resort is going to go ahead and be set. Let's go ahead and ping the loopback 0 address of R1, and we can get there from R2. Now let's go ahead and let's actually enable EIGRP Classic on R3. So what I'll do here is I'll say network. We are under the address family, by the way, so we're directly under this address family right now. You can tell that by the fact it tells us address family here. So I'm going to say network 10.1.3.1, and again, all zeros. Exit show run section router EIGRP. And there's our configuration. Let's head over to 3, router EIGRP 123, redistribute connected, and we'll say network 10.1.3.3, 000, and this should bring up an adjacency right away. And you can see that it does. Why am I doing this? There are many deeper things here going on, to be honest with you. So there's the wide metric versus the classic metric. There's some things going on here under the hood, behind the scenes, that I'm not going to explain here in this video. The point is that some folks believe that in order for us to get a named mode adjacency in between a classic and a named, we have to do a lot of different tweaking. That's just not true. As you can see here, we can get a named mode adjacency to come up with a classic configuration. It will work, because you see here that we are getting the 3 loopback addresses here that are coming in from R3. They're being redistributed. That's why we have the autonomous, the administrative distance is 70. We have our DEX routes. We're good. I should be able to ping 192.168.3.3 from our source, loopback 0. And we're happy. We're go lucky, right? So do show run section router EIGRP. Very simple. This is our configuration that we may have, still left from our routers 10 years ago. Our old 2600s that might still be working. So show run section router EIGRP, here's the new config that we might have. R1 is kind of this hub, so he's going to have a bigger config. So okay, let's get IPv6 in here. Let's actually take a look at what it would take to get IPv6 up and running. First, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and configure IPv6 over on R3, because that's kind of the bigger pain in the butt, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say exit. And what I will do is I will say IPv6 unicast routing. That's kind of the how-to, right? We have to do that. And then what I'll do is I'll say interface Ethernet 01 IPv6. We'll say 2000. We'll say 2015 :3/64. Whoop, seriously, who forgets to put an address? So we'll say interface loopback 0 IPv6 address, and I'm going to say 2003 because it's R3, and we'll say : 3/128. Let's say do show IPv6 interface brief E assigned, as well as admin down, and our interfaces are correct. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say interface range E01 and loopback 0, and I'm going to say IPv6 EIGRP 123. Exit. Do show run interface Ethernet 03. So this is what we would have to do if we were bringing up an adjacency. I also kind of like to say IPv6 router EIGRP 123, just to make sure it's there. Do show run section router EIGRP, right? So here's our IPv6 adjacency here, or IPv6 configuration for R3. You know, I could go in and I could give this guy a router ID if I wanted to. You guys know my habit, so I could go in and I could say router ID. Why doesn't it like it? EIGRP router ID. That's right. So I could go in and I could give it a router ID if I wanted to, but not going to bother. Do show run section or do show run interface Ethernet 01. So all of our do show run interface E01. So all of our routers, all of our interfaces rather, would need this configuration in order to run IPv6. Let's go take a look at what we need to do on our one. So IPv6 unicast routing, and we'll go ahead and we'll say interface E01. And we'll say IPv6 address 2015:1/64. What I'm going to do is say interface loopback 0, and we'll say IPv6 address 2001 because it's R1, and we'll say :1/128. Do show IPv6 interface brief E assigned as well as admin down, and you can see here that we have both of our addresses. So this is good. Let's say do show run section router EIGRP. The coolest thing about this is that all we need to do is simply enable an IPv6 address family. Oops, sorry. Autonomous system 123, and we're done. Do show run section router EIGRP. You can see that we have an adjacency with IPv6 that came up automatically. It came up instantly. We didn't have to enable anything. We didn't have to do anything. We didn't have to go, other than assigning our addresses. We didn't have to go under the interfaces and do anything or assign anything. In EIGRP named mode, it just automatically came up the minute we activated an address family in IPv6. Now, there are some things around this. I'm going to show you one trick in a minute, but we have all the same commands underneath the IPv6 address family. You're still going to have your AF interface. You're still going to have your topology base. In fact, if I really want to, let me actually come in here so I can just type this and say redistribute connected, exit, do show run section router EIGRP. So I can still come in under the address family, still redistribute any of my connected routes. So I can still do all that. Let's go ahead on R2, and we actually need another address here. So we'll say interface E00, and we'll say IPv6 address 2016:1/64. What did I do? I forgot the second colon. There we go. Let's go to 2. Config T, IPv6, unicast routing. We'll say interface E00, IPv6 address 2016. By the way, it makes my life easier just to do it by years. So we'll say :2/64, interface loopback 0, IPv6 address, and we're going to say 2002 because it's R2, :2/128. Do show IPv6 interface brief E assigned as well as admin down. By the way, those of you guys that didn't see my OSPF video, the reason why I exclude admin down as well is because it will give you all the admin down interfaces, and I really loathe that. So I just go ahead and say admin down as well, and just so it filters it down. So we have our interfaces that are up and running. So in theory now, do show run section router EIGRP, all we should have to do is go into our process and say IPv6, and in fact, we can just copy and paste the rest of this, and essentially we're done. And you can see, again, we have an adjacency that comes right up. Do show run section router EIGRP. So bringing up an IPv6 address family, an IPv6 adjacency in EIGRP is much, much, much easier than dealing with classic mode where you had to go under each interface and enable it there, and then you may have to go underneath your process to add additional options. You don't have to do that anymore. Now, what I want to do is I want to say show IPv6 route EIGRP. And you can see that we have the loopback address to R3. We have the loopback address to R1. We even have the network that's in between R1 and R3, which was that 2015 network. So we have IPv6 up and running. But I want you to take notice here. Notice that everything is coming in with a administrative distance of 90. Well, what are one of the ways we can change that in EIGRP? Well, let's take a look. Do show run section router EIGRP. You can see that, again, automatically what had happened was that because we had IPv6 enabled on our interfaces, because we had addresses, they were automatically added to our EIGRP process. Well, what if we don't want that? What we can do we can come into the address family, we can say address family interface, and then enter in maybe the interface that we're looking for, and we can go ahead and say shut down. So in this case, we'll just pick on the loopback address here of the loopback 0 of R1. So now, do show run section router EIGRP, what we've done is we've shut down the EIGRP process on that interface. Okay, we've gone ahead and just said, hey, I don't want you to send any multicast hellos out of it. I don't want you to do any of that anymore. However, because in our topology base we've said redistribute connected, what we should see is we should see this entry here now flip and be an administrative distance of 170, and there we have it, because now that loopback 0 interface is now being redistributed rather than being essentially advertised, quote unquote, into our EIGRP process. Automatically, our IPv6 is going to enter in those network commands for us. So remember that in EIGRP, when you go ahead and you use the network command, what that does is that goes ahead and starts sending out multicast hellos out any interface that matches that network command. And in so doing, it goes ahead and adds that entry into EIGRP to let people know, hey, I know where this network is. I have this network. Come to me if you want to reach it. Well, that automatically happens with IPv6. We don't need to add network commands. We don't need to no-shut interfaces. All we need to do is just activate the address family. However, again, if we want to remove interfaces from that process, we would have to go in and either make them a passive interface or shut them down, as I've done here. And then if you redistribute connected, you'll go ahead and flip that around. So here's how we deal with address families, specifically IPv4 and IPv6 in EIGRP named mode.